"Don't talk to the old lady, she's just the maid." Heather's voice rang out across the resort courtyard, bright and careless, as if she were commenting on the weather instead of on Margaret Collins, who stood no more than 10 feet away holding her grandson's damp beach towel in her hands. The late afternoon sun glinted off the turquoise pool behind them, and the scent of sunscreen and salt air drifted through the warm Florida breeze, but in that single suspended second, everything felt strangely still. Margaret did not flinch. She did not drop the towel. She did not correct her daughter-in-law. At 72 years old, she had learned that dignity was often quiet. Around her, guests in linen shirts and wide-brimmed hats continued chatting, waitstaff carried trays of iced tea and sparkling water, and her family gathered near the cabanas for a group photo meant to commemorate their perfect summer vacation. Daniel, her son, adjusted his sunglasses and stared at his phone as though he hadn't heard a word. The grandchildren looked confused, glancing between their mother and their grandmother, unsure whether the comment was a joke. Margaret's fingers tightened slightly on the striped towel before she folded it neatly over her arm. She had paid for this trip. Every suite, every poolside dinner, every rental SUV lined up in the parking garage beneath the palms, arranged and covered through the family trust her late husband had established decades ago. Yet in that moment, she stood at the edge of the courtyard in a loose cotton blouse and sensible sandals, feeling less like the matriarch and more like hired help who had wandered into the wrong frame. Heather laughed lightly, waving off a hotel attendant who had approached with fresh towels, as if to reinforce the image she had just painted. "We've got it handled," she said breezily, gesturing toward Margaret without looking at her directly. The attendant hesitated, then offered a polite nod and stepped back. Margaret met his eyes and gave him a small, reassuring smile, the kind she had perfected over years of smoothing over discomfort at holiday dinners and school graduations. She walked toward the row of lounge chairs where the family's belongings were scattered, flip-flops, designer sunglasses, half-empty cups sweating in the heat, and began tidying them with calm, deliberate movements. No one asked her to. No one thanked her either. Daniel finally glanced up, his expression unreadable. Then turned back to Heather as she adjusted her wide-brimmed hat and called for everyone to gather closer for the photo. "Mom, you coming?" he asked absently, already positioning himself beside his wife. Margaret paused. She considered stepping into the frame, standing tall between her son and the ocean, claiming her rightful place in the story. Instead, she shook her head gently. "I'll take it," she said, lifting the phone from Heather's outstretched hand before it could fall into someone else's grip. She framed them carefully, the children in front, Heather radiant at the center, Daniel's arm draped casually around her shoulders. She captured the image with steady hands. In the reflection on the phone's darkened screen after the shutter clicked, she caught a faint glimpse of herself standing alone, just outside the border. The laughter resumed immediately. Plans for dinner were discussed, seafood at the marina, reservations under Heather's name. Margaret listened quietly, the word "maid" echoing in her mind not as an insult, but as a revelation. It was not the first time she had been reduced to a background role. There had been other comments over the years, smaller, easier to dismiss. But this one had been public. Intentional. She handed the phone back without comment and stepped aside as the family drifted toward the elevators. The Florida sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the courtyard tiles. Margaret remained by the pool for a moment longer, feeling the warmth on her face and the cool stone beneath her sandals. She straightened her shoulders, folded the towel once more, and followed at a measured pace, her silence heavier than any protest she could have made. That evening the Marina restaurant glowed with soft string lights and the low hum of conversation as Margaret followed her family across the wooden dock, the planks creaking gently beneath their steps while boats rocked in dark water only a few feet away. The air smelled of grilled shrimp and lemon butter, and a chalkboard near the entrance listed the catch of the day in looping white letters. Heather walked ahead confidently, giving her name to the hostess as though she had arranged everything herself. Daniel stood beside her, one hand resting lightly at the small of her back, nodding along as if he belonged to a life that required no explanation. Margaret lingered half a step behind, her cardigan folded neatly over her arm despite the warm 78-degree evening, observing the choreography that had become so familiar over the years. When the hostess reached for menus, she hesitated and glanced at Margaret with polite uncertainty. Heather smiled brightly and said, "She will sit at the end, she prefers it," without once turning to confirm whether that was true. Margaret offered a calm nod and took the seat at the far edge of the long wooden table, the one closest to the railing and the dark stretch of water beyond. From there she could see everything. She could see how Heather ordered a bottle of white wine without asking who would be paying. She could see how Daniel laughed a little too quickly at his wife's jokes. She could see how the grandchildren watched her carefully, as though measuring the difference between the woman who read them bedtime stories and the one who had been described so casually by the pool. When the waiter approached to confirm the reservation, he placed the leather check folder near Heather's elbow by instinct. Margaret noticed the brief flicker of surprise on Heather's face when the waiter added, "And thank you, Mrs. Collins, for arranging the suite and dinner package for your family this week. It is an honor to host you again." The emphasis was gentle but unmistakable. Heather's smile tightened for half a second before she lifted her glass and redirected the conversation toward sightseeing plans for the next day. Margaret said nothing. She unfolded her napkin and placed it carefully in her lap. The comment by the pool had not been impulsive, she realized. It had been a small performance. A subtle rewriting of roles. If repeated often enough, it might have become the truth in the eyes of strangers. She sipped her water slowly, listening as Heather discussed potential upgrades to a larger beachfront property for future summers, speaking as though those decisions rested solely in her hands. Daniel agreed absent-mindedly, promising to look into financing options once they returned home to Chicago. Margaret's expression did not change, but inside she began to review numbers and documents with the precision of someone who had managed household accounts for over 40 years. The condo overlooking this very marina was not financed through Daniel. It belonged to the trust established by her late husband, Thomas Collins, whose careful planning had ensured that Margaret would never depend on anyone's approval to enjoy the life they had built together. The trust specified that she retained full control during her lifetime. No one could upgrade, refinance, or access it without her signature. As plates of seafood were set down and conversation drifted toward vacation photos, Margaret noticed how often Heather referred to the trip as something she and Daniel had generously organized. Each mention landed softly but deliberately, like a stitch securing a new narrative. Margaret smiled politely when spoken to, answered questions about the grandchildren's school projects, and complimented the sunset when prompted. Yet beneath her composure a quiet decision was taking shape. She would not correct Heather publicly. She would not argue across a dinner table under string lights. But she would not allow herself to be erased either. When the check arrived, the waiter placed it once again near Heather. Before Heather could reach for it, Margaret extended her hand calmly and said, "I will take care of this as usual." Her voice was gentle, almost affectionate. Daniel opened his mouth as if to protest, then closed it. Heather's fingers hovered for a moment before withdrawing. The transaction took less than a minute. The receipt was signed in Margaret's steady handwriting. And as the family rose from the table and admired the moon reflecting off the marina water, Margaret understood something with absolute clarity. Silence could be mistaken for weakness by those who did not understand it. But silence, when paired with knowledge and patience, could also be power. The next morning dawned bright and humid, the kind of Florida heat that settled in before 9 o'clock and wrapped around the skin like a warm blanket. Margaret woke before the rest of the family, as she always did, and sat on the small balcony of her suite with a cup of black coffee, watching pelicans glide low over the water. From this height, 5 stories above the marina, she could see the fishing boats heading out and the first joggers moving along the paved path below. The condo was quiet behind her, the air conditioning humming softly, the guest rooms still dark. She had chosen this corner unit years ago because Thomas loved the sunrise view. He used to stand exactly where she was standing now, one hand resting on the railing, planning their day in that thoughtful, steady way of his. Margaret closed her eyes briefly and let the memory settle. Then she went back inside and opened the leather portfolio she kept in her suitcase. Inside were copies of the trust documents, neatly organized, each page marked with small tabs. She had not brought them with any particular plan in mind, but after the previous day, she was glad she had. Around 10 o'clock, the family gathered in the lobby to head to a private boat tour Heather had enthusiastically booked. Heather wore oversized sunglasses and a wide straw hat, speaking animatedly about how she had secured the best captain in the area. Daniel carried a cooler filled with bottled water and fruit, and the grandchildren bounced with excitement. Margaret joined them with a calm smile, dressed in a simple navy blouse and white slacks, moving at her usual measured pace. When they reached the dock, the captain greeted them warmly and said, "Good to see you again, Mrs. Collins. We have the same route as last summer unless you would like to change it." Heather's expression flickered, almost imperceptibly, before she laughed and said, "Oh, she has been coming here forever." Margaret noticed how quickly Heather shifted the tone, turning familiarity into something that sounded quaint rather than authoritative. As the boat pulled away from the dock and the shoreline began to recede, Heather took the seat beside the captain, peppering him with questions about waterfront properties and recent sales in the area. She spoke as though scouting investments, mentioning how wonderful it would be to expand their summer footprint. Daniel nodded along, occasionally glancing at Margaret, perhaps wondering whether she would object. Margaret did not object. She listened. She observed the way Heather referred to the condo as our place and described future renovations that had never been discussed with her. The breeze lifted strands of her silver hair as she looked out over the water, but inside her thoughts were sharp and clear. Ownership was not a matter of who spoke the loudest. It was a matter of names on documents and signatures on file. Midway through the tour, the captain pointed toward a cluster of newly built waterfront homes and said that prices had risen nearly 15% in the past year. Heather leaned closer, clearly intrigued, and asked about financing options and seasonal rental potential. Margaret folded her hands in her lap and considered the implications. If Heather believed that this lifestyle was already hers to manage, she had misunderstood something fundamental. Later, when the boat returned to the dock and everyone thanked the captain, he handed Margaret a small envelope with updated maintenance information for the condo association. He did so without hesitation, as one would to the recognized owner. Heather watched the exchange carefully. Margaret slipped the envelope into her bag without comment. That afternoon, while the others rested or scrolled through their phones, Margaret placed a quiet call from her bedroom to the attorney who oversaw the trust back in Chicago. She did not raise her voice. She did not express anger. She simply asked for a review of beneficiary designations and clarification on access rights during her lifetime. The conversation was calm, professional, and thorough. When she ended the call, she felt neither triumphant nor upset. She felt prepared. Outside her door, she could hear Heather laughing in the living area, already planning the next family vacation as though it were guaranteed. Margaret smoothed the front of her blouse, stepped into the hallway, and joined them with the same gentle composure she had maintained all week. The difference was that now her silence carried intention. The afternoon settled into a heavy, golden stillness as the family gathered in the living area of the condo, ceiling fans turning lazily above them while sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows and stretched across the polished hardwood floors. Heather sat at the kitchen island with her laptop open, scrolling through real estate listings and angled photographs of waterfront homes, her voice light and confident as she described square footage and outdoor kitchens as if narrating a future already secured. Daniel leaned against the counter beside her, sipping sparkling water and nodding along, occasionally glancing toward his mother as though measuring her reaction. The grandchildren were sprawled on the sectional sofa, half watching a nature program and half listening to the adults discuss plans that extended far beyond the current week. Margaret took her usual seat in the armchair near the window, hands folded loosely in her lap, her posture relaxed but attentive. She listened to Heather outline renovation ideas for the existing condo, suggesting that walls could be removed to create a more modern open concept and that the guest wing could be redesigned into a private suite for short-term rentals during the off-season. The tone was casual, but the assumptions were bold. At one point Heather said, "We should really think about restructuring ownership so everything is streamlined under Daniel. It would make things simpler for tax purposes." The room grew subtly quieter. Daniel shifted his weight and cleared his throat, offering a noncommittal response about looking into it later. Margaret felt the weight of the words settle in the air. Restructuring ownership was not a small adjustment. It was a transfer of control. She did not interrupt. Instead she rose slowly and walked to the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of iced tea from the pitcher she had prepared earlier. The clink of ice against glass sounded unusually sharp in the pause that followed. She returned to her chair and spoke in a tone that was neither defensive nor confrontational. She said that any structural changes would require legal review because the property was held in a trust with specific protections in place. She did not elaborate further. Heather smiled, but the smile did not fully reach her eyes. She responded that she was only thinking ahead for the family, for efficiency, for long-term growth. Margaret nodded politely. She understood the language of growth and efficiency. She had spent decades balancing budgets, managing investments, and supporting her husband's business decisions with quiet diligence. The difference was that she had never assumed control over something that was not hers. As the conversation drifted toward dinner plans, Margaret noticed how frequently Heather framed future summers as though Margaret's presence were optional, even temporary. Phrases like "when we take over" and "once everything is under us" slipped into the discussion with increasing confidence. Margaret did not correct each one. She did not need to. That evening, after the grandchildren went down to the pool and Daniel stepped out to take a work call, Heather approached Margaret alone on the balcony. The sun was beginning to set, casting soft pink reflections over the marina. Heather leaned against the railing and said in a measured voice that it might be time for Margaret to relax more and let the younger generation handle the logistics of vacation properties. The words were wrapped in concern, but the implication was clear. Margaret studied the horizon before answering. She said that she appreciated the enthusiasm, but stewardship required more than energy. It required responsibility, documentation, and accountability. Her tone remained gentle, yet there was a steadiness in it that had not been present earlier in the week. Heather fell quiet for a moment, perhaps realizing that the assumptions she had been building were not as solid as she believed. When Daniel returned, the conversation shifted again to neutral topics, but the atmosphere had changed. Margaret sensed it in the subtle distance, in the way Heather's laughter sounded slightly forced. Later that night, as Margaret prepared for bed, she reviewed the envelope from the condo association once more and placed it back into her portfolio beside the trust documents. She did not feel anger. She felt clarity. The attempt to redefine her role had become unmistakable. And clarity, she knew, was the first step toward action. The following morning carried a quieter tension, subtle but unmistakable, like the faint shift in air before a summer storm that never quite breaks. Margaret rose early again, dressed carefully in a pale blue blouse and tailored slacks, and suggested a simple breakfast at a small cafe 2 blocks from the marina. The walk took less than 5 minutes, the sidewalks already warm beneath their shoes as seagulls circled overhead and delivery trucks hummed along the coastal road. Heather seemed distracted, checking her phone repeatedly, while Daniel discussed an upcoming meeting back in Chicago. The grandchildren walked ahead, arguing gently about who would sit by the window. Inside the cafe, the scent of fresh coffee and toasted bread filled the air. Margaret chose a table near the front window, sunlight streaming across the wooden surface, illuminating the fine lines on her hands as she folded her napkin. When the server approached, Margaret greeted her by name. It was not a coincidence. She had been coming here for nearly 12 years. The server smiled warmly and asked if she would like her usual. Heather glanced up at that, her expression sharpening with brief curiosity. As orders were placed, Margaret observed the dynamic unfolding with increasing clarity. Heather spoke confidently about returning next season for an extended stay, mentioning that it might be wise to formalize certain arrangements so there would be no confusion about decision-making authority. The phrasing was smooth, almost rehearsed. Daniel agreed that clarity was important for the future. Margaret stirred her coffee slowly, the spoon making a soft, rhythmic sound against porcelain. When the food arrived, conversation shifted to lighter topics, but beneath it ran the same undercurrent. Heather referred to long-term plans as though Margaret's current control were merely transitional. It was not hostility. It was positioning. Margaret understood positioning. After breakfast, as the family stepped back into the bright mid-morning heat, Margaret told them she needed to stop by the condo association office to confirm a maintenance schedule. She said it casually, as though it were a minor errand. Heather offered to accompany her, but Margaret declined with a gentle smile, explaining that it would not take long. The office was located in a small stucco building adjacent to the main property complex. Inside, the air conditioning was brisk, and framed photographs of past renovations lined the walls. The property manager greeted Margaret with professional respect and updated her on upcoming structural improvements, including balcony reinforcement and exterior painting scheduled for early fall. He handed her a packet outlining projected costs and timelines. Margaret listened carefully, asking precise questions about access rights, vendor approvals, and any documentation required from the trust. The conversation was calm and detailed. When she returned to the condo an hour later, Heather was seated at the dining table with spreadsheets open on her laptop. She looked up quickly, perhaps expecting new information she could incorporate into her plans. Margaret placed the packet neatly on the kitchen counter and said that the association would be sending official correspondence directly to her attorney for review. Heather's fingers paused above the keyboard. Daniel glanced between them, sensing the shift. Margaret's tone remained even, but the message was unmistakable. Oversight would not be transferred casually. That afternoon, while the others headed to the beach with umbrellas and folding chairs, Margaret remained behind for a short while, making another quiet call to her attorney to confirm that any future requests for restructuring ownership would require her explicit written consent and formal review. The assurance she received was steady and unequivocal. She joined the family at the shoreline later, the sand warm beneath her sandals and the Gulf waters shimmering under the sun. The grandchildren ran toward her with excitement, eager to show her shells they had found. Margaret knelt carefully, examining each one with genuine interest. She smiled easily, her composure intact. Heather watched from a distance, perhaps realizing that influence did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it resided in documents, in history, in relationships built over decades. As the tide rolled in gently at their feet, Margaret understood that the week was no longer about relaxation. It was about boundaries. And she was fully awake to them. By the 6th day of the trip, the rhythm of the household had shifted in subtle but measurable ways. Margaret no longer rose to clear every breakfast plate or automatically gather damp towels from the back of chairs. She still moved with grace and attentiveness, but her help was offered selectively rather than assumed. That morning, sunlight filtered through sheer curtains as the family prepared for a guided tour of a historic lighthouse 30 miles up the coast. Heather stood near the entryway coordinating departure times, reminding everyone to bring sunscreen and water bottles, her tone brisk and managerial. Daniel searched for the car keys while the grandchildren debated which playlist to play during the drive. Margaret sat at the dining table reviewing a small folder she had assembled the night before, containing printed confirmation emails from her attorney and a brief summary of the trust's primary provisions. She did not intend to present them dramatically. She simply preferred to have facts close at hand. As they drove north along the coastal highway, the Atlantic stretching wide and bright to their right, Heather resumed the conversation about long-term plans. She spoke about consolidating assets, about simplifying the structure of ownership, about ensuring that Daniel could act quickly on opportunities without unnecessary delays. Her language was polished and forward-thinking. Margaret listened quietly from the passenger seat, observing the way Daniel nodded reflexively. When they arrived at the lighthouse, a white tower rising nearly 100 feet above the shoreline, the group began the climb up the narrow spiral staircase. Margaret moved carefully, one hand on the railing, her breathing steady despite the exertion. She had climbed these steps before with Thomas, years earlier, when their grandchildren were toddlers. At the top, wind swept across the observation deck, carrying the scent of salt and distant rain. The view stretched for miles in every direction. Heather stood beside Daniel and gestured toward undeveloped land along the water, speculating about future investments and vacation homes that could appreciate significantly over the next decade. Margaret allowed the conversation to unfold before she spoke. Her voice was calm but carried clearly in the open air. She said that any restructuring of the condo or associated assets would require a formal review by the trust attorney and that she had already initiated that review. Daniel turned toward her, surprised. Heather's expression tightened briefly before she composed herself. Margaret continued gently, explaining that the trust had been designed specifically to protect long-term stability and prevent impulsive transfers of ownership. She emphasized that stewardship meant safeguarding assets until the appropriate time, not accelerating transitions for convenience. The wind lifted the edge of her blouse as she looked out over the ocean, her posture straight despite the height and the breeze. No accusation was made. No anger was displayed. She simply stated facts. On the descent back down the staircase, the mood was noticeably quieter. Heather no longer outlined renovation plans with the same certainty. Daniel asked his mother a few careful questions about timelines and legal procedures, perhaps realizing for the first time that control was not as flexible as he had assumed. Later, during lunch at a seaside cafe overlooking the dunes, Margaret noticed a shift in seating. This time Daniel chose to sit beside her rather than across from Heather. Conversation remained polite, but the hierarchy that had seemed so clear at the start of the week was beginning to blur. Margaret did not interpret this as victory. She interpreted it as awareness. That evening, back at the condo, she received an email from her attorney confirming that beneficiary designations could be adjusted at her discretion and that no modifications would proceed without her explicit authorization. She closed the laptop slowly, feeling a steady reassurance settle within her. Outside, laughter drifted in from the balcony where Heather was recounting the day's events to the children. Margaret stepped out to join them, her presence composed and unshaken. The attempt to redefine her role had met its first boundary. And she had established it without raising her voice. The final full day of the vacation arrived with a subtle shift in tone that even the children seemed to sense. Breakfast was quieter, the usual easy chatter replaced by longer pauses and more careful phrasing. Margaret noticed that Heather no longer spoke as confidently about immediate changes to the condo or ownership structure. Instead, her comments were measured, framed as suggestions rather than assumptions. Daniel, for his part, appeared thoughtful, occasionally glancing at his mother as if reassessing conversations that had unfolded earlier. In the week, the Florida sky was clear and bright, the temperature already climbing toward 85 degrees by late morning as the family prepared for a casual gathering on the beach to mark their last night together. They set up folding chairs and umbrellas in the sand, arranging a small portable table for snacks and drinks. Margaret moved deliberately, helping where appropriate but no longer stepping into the role of silent organizer. When Heather struggled to secure one of the umbrellas against the steady breeze, Margaret offered a practical suggestion about angling it lower and anchoring it with a cooler. Heather followed the advice without comment. It was a small exchange, yet it carried a quiet acknowledgement of experience. As the afternoon unfolded, Daniel approached Margaret while the children waded in the shallow surf. He asked her directly about the trust, about what protections it provided and why it had been structured the way it was. His tone was respectful, perhaps even cautious. Margaret explained calmly that Thomas had designed it to ensure long-term stability and to prevent any single person from making unilateral decisions that could jeopardize shared assets. She emphasized that the structure was not about control for its own sake, but about stewardship and timing. Daniel listened carefully, his earlier confidence replaced by a more reflective expression. A few yards away, Heather watched the conversation from beneath her sun hat. She did not interrupt. As sunset approached, the sky shifted into shades of coral and lavender, casting long shadows across the sand. The family gathered for one final photograph, the ocean stretching wide behind them. This time, before anyone assigned positions, Daniel turned to his mother and said that she should stand in the center. There was no dramatic announcement, no apology spoken aloud, but the gesture itself altered the frame. Margaret stepped forward without hesitation, her posture steady, her silver hair catching the soft evening light. Heather stood beside her rather than ahead of her, her expression composed but subdued. The camera clicked. The image captured a different balance than the one from earlier in the week. Afterward, as they packed up chairs and brushed sand from their shoes, Heather approached Margaret quietly. She said that perhaps they should schedule a formal meeting with the attorney once they returned home, so everyone would clearly understand the structure and expectations. The tone was cooperative rather than assertive. Margaret agreed that clarity was beneficial for all involved. She did not interpret the shift as defeat on Heather's part. She saw it as recognition that assumptions had limits. That night, back at the condo, suitcases were zipped and stacked near the door. Margaret stood alone for a moment on the balcony, looking out over the marina where boats rocked gently in their slips. The week had begun with a careless label meant to diminish her role. It was ending with a quiet recalibration of boundaries. She had not argued publicly. She had not demanded apologies. Instead, she had relied on documentation, composure, and patience. As the lights of the harbor reflected on the dark water below, Margaret felt a calm certainty settle within her. Respect, she knew, was not secured by volume. It was secured by knowing exactly where one stood and refusing to step aside. The morning of departure arrived with the soft hum of elevators and the distant roll of suitcases across tile floors. Sunlight streamed through the windows one last time, illuminating half-packed bags and neatly folded blankets. Margaret moved calmly through the condo, checking drawers and closets with practiced attention, ensuring nothing was left behind. The atmosphere felt different from the first day of the trip. There was no careless laughter, no exaggerated claims about future renovations. Instead, conversations were practical, measured. Heather reviewed flight times on her phone while Daniel coordinated transportation to the airport. The grandchildren wandered from room to room, already nostalgic, asking when they would return next summer. Margaret listened carefully to that question. When Daniel mentioned tentatively that they could start planning for the same week next year, Margaret paused beside the kitchen counter and set down the set of keys she had been holding. Her voice was gentle but unmistakably firm. She explained that next summer might look different. She had decided that she would spend a portion of the season traveling independently, possibly visiting friends in Arizona or taking a guided tour through the Pacific Northwest. The condo would not automatically be reserved for extended family stays without prior discussion and written agreement. The statement was delivered without tension, yet it reshaped the room. Heather blinked, clearly recalculating assumptions. Daniel asked what she meant, and Margaret clarified that access to the property would be scheduled intentionally, not presumed. She emphasized that stewardship required boundaries and that she intended to enjoy the years ahead on her own terms as well. There was no accusation in her tone, no reference to past remarks. She simply outlined the new structure with clarity. Heather attempted a polite smile and said that of course everyone would coordinate more formally in the future. Margaret nodded, accepting the sentiment at face value. When it was time to leave, the family gathered near the elevator. Margaret handed Daniel a folder containing a summary of the trust provisions and contact information for the attorney, explaining that transparency would prevent confusion later. Daniel accepted it with a seriousness that had not been present earlier in the week. The drive to the airport was quiet, the Florida coastline slipping by in steady stretches of blue and white. At the drop-off lane, suitcases were unloaded and hugs exchanged. The grandchildren embraced Margaret tightly, asking her to send photos of any future trips she might take. She promised that she would. Heather offered a brief but cordial embrace, her posture more restrained than before. Daniel lingered for a moment longer, thanking his mother for the vacation and for the clarity she had provided. Margaret looked at her son with steady eyes and said that family was strongest when respect was mutual and roles were understood. It was not a lecture. It was a principle. After they passed through the sliding glass doors into the terminal, Margaret remained by the curb for a few seconds, feeling the humid air against her face and listening to the distant roar of departing planes. She did not feel resentment. She felt resolution. The week had begun with a careless attempt to redefine her position. It ended with documentation, boundaries, and a quiet shift in understanding. She instructed the driver to take her back to the marina one more time before her own later flight. As the car pulled away from the airport, Margaret glanced at the folder resting in her lap and allowed herself a small, private smile. She had not raised her voice. She had not argued across a table. Yet the message had been delivered with unmistakable clarity. She was not an accessory to someone else's plans. She was the foundation upon which those plans had been built. After the car returned her to the marina, Margaret asked the driver to wait while she stepped inside the condo one final time. The unit felt different without the layered voices of her family echoing through it. The air was still, the faint scent of ocean salt drifting in through the slightly open balcony door. Suitcases were gone, countertops cleared, the living room restored to its original order. She walked slowly from room to room, pausing not out of sentimentality but out of intention. In the guest wing, she adjusted the blinds and checked the thermostat, making small, deliberate movements that reminded her this space was not temporary or borrowed. It was hers. On the kitchen island, she placed a single sheet of paper beside the folder she would mail to her attorney once she returned to Chicago. The paper contained updated instructions, seasonal access by written request, no structural modifications without formal review, beneficiary reevaluation scheduled for the end of the year. The language was concise and professional. There was no emotional commentary attached. She stepped onto the balcony and leaned lightly against the railing, watching boats move through the channel below. A young couple walked along the dock hand in hand, laughing easily, unaware of the quiet recalibration that had taken place inside this condo over the past week. Margaret did not feel bitterness when she thought of Heather. She understood ambition. She understood the desire to secure comfort and status. What she did not accept was erasure. The memory of that careless label still hovered in her mind, but it no longer stung. It had become a catalyst instead. Later that afternoon, as she sat in the airport waiting area for her own flight home, her phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. He thanked her again for the trip and wrote that he had not fully understood the structure of the trust until now. He said he respected her decision to set clearer boundaries and hoped they could continue future vacations with better communication. Margaret read the message slowly, then responded that communication was welcome, but clarity would remain non-negotiable. She added that family relationships were strongest when no one attempted to minimize another's role. A few minutes later, another message appeared from Heather. It was brief, politely worded, expressing appreciation for the week and agreement about scheduling a formal meeting with the attorney. Margaret noticed the careful tone, the absence of assumption. She replied with equal politeness and suggested a date in early October. When her flight was called, she boarded calmly, storing her small carry-on in the overhead compartment before taking her seat by the window. As the plane lifted off the runway and the Florida coastline shrank into a thin ribbon of sand and water, she reflected on the arc of the week. There had been no confrontation, no raised voices, no dramatic declarations. There had been documentation, measured conversations, and a steady refusal to be repositioned as something less than she was. Back in Chicago, autumn would soon settle in, painting the trees outside her home in shades of gold and red. She imagined herself hosting a quiet dinner with close friends, planning a winter trip on her own schedule, reviewing trust documents with confidence rather than urgency. The foundation Thomas had built remained intact because she had chosen to protect it. As the plane leveled above the clouds, Margaret rested her hands in her lap and allowed a small, private sense of assurance to settle within her. Respect had not been demanded. It had been demonstrated. And from this point forward, no one would mistake her place in her own story.